Ladies and gentlemen, this RegGamer.com video, we have a whole slew of technology news. Some of it would be Intel, and then we're going to mosey on over to DX12 stuff, as both AMD and Nvidia are focusing on the next GDC event, where they're going to be talking about all DX12 informations. That was terrible. I should feel bad for how terrible that was. Anyway, so the first piece of Intel news, because there are a couple, is an update regarding the non-K overclocking features in SkyLake. So for those of you who are not too familiar with the events, essentially, if you own a 6700K, for sake of argument, as you all know, Intel fully endorses you to be able to overclock as you would wish to get the most out of your processor. So you simply raise the multiplier, and that in conjunction with the base clock will give you an overclocked performance. But for some time now, certain motherboard vendors, for example ASRock, have allowed you to overclock non-Ks by essentially raising the base clock of the processor, which is what Intel actually didn't want you to do. They were very much frowny on that, and it didn't really surprise many people when there were some rumours that started to circulate from bench life that Intel were actually readying an update to essentially lock this down, and were going to force various motherboard vendors to release that update to their users. Unfortunately, this is the case. ASRock have just released an update for their own motherboards, via the BIOS obviously, which removes the SkyOC feature. Now obviously this means that Intel are asking vendors to disable overclocking support for their motherboards, but the problem is that not only does the SkyOC feature limit users from overclocking their on-K chips, but it also means that you're going to see it disabled for non-Z series motherboards. Essentially, just how bad this is also kind of up in the air, but it could theoretically mean we're going to see a lot less tweaking even for the K derivatives of processors. Now, either way you look at this sucks absolute balls, and I imagine a lot of users are very unhappy. Now obviously if you've got something like a 6700K, it's less of a big deal, but if you are one of those to jump on the, let's say, the 6100 bandwagon, which was a really good processor, very overclockable, and a lot of people were recommending it because of the performance versus the price and the cheap way to get into SkyLake, I can imagine a lot of people are very unhappy about that. Now it's worth noting that this particular BIOS update, which is 2.10, once again for ASRock, was released on the 4th of this month, so 4th of February. So it's probable that any updates from, let's say, February for the particular motherboard vendors in question are going to limit, or is going to limit, the overclocking functionality. Does that mean you shouldn't update? Well, honestly, here's my rule with BIOS updates. While they're nowhere near as risky as they used to be, and certainly a lot easier, typically I don't update providing there's no need to. So for the sake of argument, your PC's running fine. Generally speaking, a BIOS update is not going to massively improve performance unless you're running a really friggin' early BIOS for your motherboard. There are some instances where a motherboard was released a bit early. For example, let's say timings were just a little bit off from the vendor, and the vendor didn't have enough time to work on the BIOS to put in all the features, and that has happened before, believe me, and thus you don't have all of the tweaking facilities that you should have on the BIOS when it was originally released. Then you can argue that updating your BIOS does indeed improve performance because it gives you more tweaking options, but other than that, it's not really worth updating your BIOS. And there are occasional users who have reported that older BIOSes have led to issues with, like, let's say CPU-Z, that type of thing, but they're very, 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 very small numbers of people who are affected by this. Me point being, I would rather stick with an older BIOS and have my overclocking fine. That's just me though. Jumping on to the next point, and this one is yet another one on Intel, and this one is actually being reported by getting it from Business Insider, but it's also being reported originally on Bloomberg, who of course deal a lot with the markets and all of that jazz. Intel currently supplies a lot of the server chips which are floating around, so obviously it doesn't necessarily affect us as end users, but for big companies such as Google it means a lot. However, it would appear that Google are less interested now in Intel, and in fact Google are one of its biggest supporters. Up to 300,000 computer chips, CPUs, have been purchased from Intel by Google per quarter. So about 1.2 million a year. That's a friggin' load of chips. So it's actually one of its biggest customers. Obviously HP and Dell remain the reigning champions. So this would certainly not mean that Intel are going away, but the loss of business, which once again Bloomberg, are reporting is going to happen, it's going to be very interesting indeed, because Qualcomm are currently making chips for a lot of smartphones, those type of gadgets. So it's quite interesting because Intel never really managed to get into the smartphone business. They've tried a couple of times, but their chips just don't seem to grab the market share. It's going to be very interesting, and what's going to be even further grinding at Intel's heels is that AMD, at least according to what they're telling investors, are going to be aggressively pursuing the server market and of course the desktop market as well. Now I'm not saying yay, at Intel go under, because I don't want that to happen. I think that's a really bad point of view from any, I like a lot of companies in a certain business because I think it's good for us as customers, but I have to admit I do kind of want Intel to get a bit of a rabbit punch with these BIOS updates. I do think it would be good for them to have a bit of a slap upside the head, which is pretty much what they received in the days of the Pentium 4 and other chips when they were competing against like the Athlon XP, the Athlon 64 as well. Everyone remember that? Yeah, anyway. So this one is a small update to DirectX 12. It's certainly not going to be telling you the informations of what the developers are going to be, necessarily talking about. But both AMD and Nvidia are going to be giving talks for APIs and virtual reality and all of the other tools for GDC. Now, the reason this is very important, of course, is we all know games at the moment are using DirectX 11 with typically focused on the 2D screens, whether it's you're running on a 720p monitor all the way to a 4K display, whatever you're running. Essentially, you're still running a 2D monitor. Of course, some lucky souls such as ourselves do have an Oculus Rift, a Decade kit, but generally speaking, games are created with that in mind. Not games in 2 years' time, and obviously these games take a long time to code, and so Nvidia are labelling their session Raise Your Game with Nvidia GeForce Tools. From the session, and I'll read it out entirely, we can certainly get some insights into what Nvidia are focusing on. A new era is beginning in PC graphics, low-level graphics APIs and VR headsets for masses that will introduce a new set of challenges for how to program graphics for next-gen games. This talk will cover the latest offerings in developer tools for DirectX 12 development and VR. Developers will learn how to recognize the new API concepts through demos and walkthroughs, as well as how to profile DX12, the new range profiler. The audiences will also be able to learn how to take advantage of Nvidia's Nsight. That's Nsight. You see what they did there? You see it? Very clever, right? Nsight Visual Studio Edition to help develop VR applications. AMD are also being fairly boastful, fairly bold with its title. Let Your Game Shine. Optimizing DirectX 12 and Vulkan performance with AMD CodeXL. I'll read out this one. AMD CodeXL is a suite of tools for software developers that demand extreme performance from their software and hardware. The new CodeXL 2.0 introduces tools for games developers who used Microsoft DirectX 12 and Vulkan programming. This presentation will review these capabilities, including capturing and visualizing the timeline of a frame, analyzing multi-threaded host and GPU interaction, pinpointing hotspot API calls, exposing inefficient GPU utilization, and much more. In addition, we'll review how to develop and build Vulkan programs containing multiple shaders, and analyze the resource demands for generating ISAs on multiple target platforms without executing them. This presentation will also review k.intel CPU profiling and power profiling capabilities. God, that was a mouthful. What the hell does some of that mean? I'm going to go for a couple of them. God, you can tell I'm tired and I've got a headache today. It's one of those days. It has been one of those days. So essentially what they're saying in terms of capturing and visualizing a timeline of a frame, as we all know, a frame of animation takes a certain amount of time to draw on screen. For example, it could take 33.33 ms, or it could take 16.6, or whatever it is, depending on the target frame rate of the game. Therefore, what happens while we can't see it, there is still a whole bunch of work that's being created. So the host, in other words the CPU in this case, obviously is now becoming multi-threaded. In other words, it can chat over multiple cores to the GPU. And now we can start seeing what's happening with the GPU. Is it being efficient? And developers can much more effectively, and once again, that word, efficiently utilize the hardware. It's worth noting that these tools have existed on console and PC before, but it's becoming increasingly important with the emergence of low-level APIs and I guess you could say that the offspring of that, or rather the necessity of that, multiple CPU cores. Essentially one of the main reasons that we're seeing low-level APIs and really the pushing towards multi-threading is because CPU vendors aren't really able to just keep cranking up the clock speeds, and now of course we're starting to have to go wide, parallel, pushing across multiple CPU cores. For example, 4 cores, 8 cores, 50 cores, 1000 cores. Might be slightly exaggerating there. And that's of course how we're going to get to that next level of performance, and we can thank consoles to some degree for that as well, because obviously developers can certainly take some of what they've learned with, let's say, the Xbox One and push that onto the next generation of PC games as well. Now, the transition for DirectX 12, as I said, is going to take some time. We're in 2016 as I'm recording this, the beginning of 2016. But by the end of 2016, and certainly moving into 2017, developers should be not only able to optimize what we've got now, so that would be the engines that have been, I guess you could say, the general workhorses for some time now, but new engines are going to start emerging, or there might be complete rewrites or rebuilds of traditional engines. For example, Epic, of course, are consistently working on the optimization and the new technology and integration of Unreal Engine. Now we're up to 4 point whatever the hell it is. But I imagine eventually it's going to be the same for many game engines, and it's going to become more and more efficient, and it should be kind of cool. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Sorry I've been a bit off today. Headache. Not the most conducive, as it turns out, to understanding technical stuff. But you've stuck with me, and I thank you, friend. Anyway, if you can hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed, or if you have subscribed, I would very much appreciate it if you click the like button. And I shall see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.